Welcome back to Materials Development for Language Learning. Choosing the right textbook can be tough for teachers. Imagine you're Miss Lin, an English teacher in Vietnam. She has to use a certain textbook. It's required by the government, but she's finding it's really focused on exams. And it's kind of boring for the students. The English doesn't even sound natural. Then a new international textbook comes out. It looks great. It promises real communication and student-centered learning. So what should Miss Lin do? Switch to the new book or try to make the old one work? This situation shows just how important it is to evaluate your textbooks carefully, especially now with so many options out there. Evaluating textbooks is really essential. It's a must-have skill for language teachers, especially with all the choices we have now. You've got open market options, and then sometimes you have to use what the government or your school tells you to use. Textbooks have a huge impact on your teaching and on your students' learning. So you have to make sure they're good. They need to match your learning objectives and fit in with national education policies. And of course, they need to work for your students because your students are all different, right? And if you don't evaluate textbooks properly, you might end up with students who are bored and not learning. And that means they might not reach their learning goals. So let's talk about how teachers can evaluate textbooks effectively. First, let's think about some basic questions. Why do we even use published materials? What do we want them to do? Can one textbook really do everything? Or should we think about making our own material sometimes? There are two main stages when you're evaluating a textbook for teaching English. The first stage is external evaluation. It's kind of like a first impression. You're quickly looking at the book structure and what the publisher says about it. It's like judging a book by its cover. The second stage is internal evaluation. This is where you really dig deep into the content. You're looking to see if what's inside the textbook matches up with what the publisher said in that external evaluation. So let's start with external evaluation. The first thing you look at is the blurb and the introduction. This is where the publisher tries to sell you the book. They talk about things like flexibility skills, integration authenticity, and how engaging it is for learners. But watch out. Sometimes what they say can be misleading. You might see a book that claims to be fully communicative. But then when you open it up, it's full of grammar drills. Not very communicative, is it? Next, you need to think about the intended audience. Who is this book for? What age group? What level of English? What kind of background do the learners have? You want to make sure the book's level matches your students' actual abilities. If a textbook is for advanced learners, but your students are only intermediate, they're going to struggle. It's important to get that right. You really need to check that the proficiency level the book says it is actually matches your students' needs. Sometimes a book says it's intermediate, but it's really more like upper intermediate. You don't want to be surprised. Another thing to think about is the teaching context. Are you teaching general English or English for specific purposes? General English is all about everyday communication skills. EST is more focused. It's for people who need English for a specific job or field, like business English or medical English. If you use a business English textbook in a general English class, it's not going to work. It's like teaching someone to swim in a bathtub. Now let's look at the book's organization and syllabus. How is the language structured? Is it in units or lessons? Is there a clear progression from one unit to the next? Does it all flow together logically? This is important because you want your students to have a smooth learning experience. Then you need to think about their author's views on language and teaching methods. What do they think is important? Grammar or communication? What kind of teaching methods do they recommend? You want to choose a textbook that uses modern best practices in language teaching. That means lots of communicative activities and real-world language use. Don't forget about the teacher's resources. What kind of support does the book provide? A good teacher's book can be really helpful. You'll have answer keys, extra activities, teaching tips, background information, and transcripts for the audio recordings. If the teacher's resources aren't good, it can make your life a lot harder. Make sure the book has useful reference tools too, like vocabulary lists and an index. These are important for students to learn new words and find information quickly. Visual materials are important in language learning, but are they actually helpful for learning, or are they just there to look pretty? Good visuals can help students understand better and enjoy learning more, but if they're just decoration, they're not serving a real purpose. Cultural sensitivity and bias are really important too. Does the textbook show a balanced view of different cultures and genders? Are there different perspectives included so all your students feel represented and respected? And in today's world, we need to think about digital components too. Are there online resources? Are they necessary? How do you access them? Do you need a special code? Are they easy to use and engaging for you and your students? Finally, let's look at the testing and assessment features. Does the book have progress tests? Do those tests reflect real-world language use, or are they just focused on grammar rules? You want your students to be able to use English in real life, so the assessment should reflect that. Okay, so you've gone through all those external evaluation criteria. Now you've got two choices. If the textbook just doesn't measure up, it's time to say goodbye. Find something else that better meets your needs. But if the textbook passes this first test, congratulations. You can move on to internal evaluation. This is where you really get into the details and see how effective the content is. Now, with internal evaluation, we're really getting to the heart of the textbook. We're going to look closely at how well it does what it sets out to do. It's all about looking at the content, the exercises, and how the book is put together to see if they actually help students learn the language. So let's look at 6 key criteria for internal evaluations. And we'll start with skills integration and authenticity. A good textbook needs to cover all 4 language skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. But it's not enough just to have them in there. They need to be integrated well and reflect how language is used in the real world. So ask yourself, does the textbook have a good balance of these skills? Are the materials authentic? Do they sound like real English that people actually use? Take listening, for example. Are the listening activities based on real conversations? Do they use different accents to show the diversity of English? Do they have activities to prepare students for listening, to keep them focused while they're listening, and to help them understand and think critically after they've listened? Now let's think about speaking. Do the speaking activities encourage real interaction and communication? Do they go beyond just practicing grammar rules? Do they give students chances to use English in real-life situations like role plays and discussions? This helps them become more fluent and confident. How about reading? Are the reading passages interesting and engaging? Do they come from a variety of sources like newspapers, websites, emails, and letters? This helps students experience different types of writing. Do the comprehension questions make students think critically, or are they just asking about basic facts? Does the textbook teach different reading strategies to help students understand difficult texts? And finally, writing. Do the writing tasks help students gradually improve their writing skills? Do they move from writing sentences to paragraphs, essays, and different types of texts? Does the textbook provide good examples of writing and allow students to give each other feedback and evaluate their own work? This helps them become more independent and reflective writers. So what are some potential issues? Well, if a textbook focuses too much on one skill and not enough on others, it could be a problem. For example, a textbook that's all about grammar might not give students enough practice speaking, and that can make it harder for them to communicate in real lives. It's also important to teach skills together so students can use them in real-life communication. Imagine trying to teach someone to bake a cake by only talking about the ingredients without ever mixing them together. Another problem is when the dialogues in a textbook are too slow, too scripted, or too formal. They don't sound like real conversations. The dialogues should sound natural and spontaneous and use different accents as speaking styles. That way, students will be better prepared for real conversations. If a textbook only uses its own texts and doesn't include authentic materials, students won't get enough exposure to real-world English. Use authentic materials like newspaper articles, websites, emails, and letters to bridge the gap between the classroom and real life. If a textbook only focuses on grammar when teaching writing, it can stifle students' creativity and ability to express themselves naturally. Writing involves so much more than just grammar. It's about vocabulary, style, organization, and ideas. All of these need to be developed through engaging and varied writing tasks. Similarly, if speaking activities are too controlled and predictable, students won't gain the confidence they need for real conversations. Give students opportunity to choose what they want to say and how they want to say it. This encourages real interaction and spontaneity. Now let's move on to our second criterion, grading and progression. This is really important for effective learning. Is there a logical progression in the textbook? Are the materials scaffolded? That means they gradually build student skills from simple to complex. Is there a clear path for learning? Do the earlier lessons provide the foundation for later lessons? Sometimes textbooks jump around between topics, and that can make it hard for students to build on what they've already learned and make connections. A well-structured textbook presents topics in a coherent sequence. Each unit builds on the one before it. It's also important to find the right pace. If the textbook moves too fast, students might get overwhelmed and frustrated, but if it moves too slowly, they might get bored. The key is to find a balance between challenge and accessibility. You want to keep your students motivated and engaged throughout the learning process. Our third criterion is the suitability of the exercises and assessments. Do the activity and tests help students learn? Do they match the objectives of the textbook? Are the exercises engaging? Do they encourage students to think for themselves? Do they go beyond just memorizing and repeating information and allow students to use their language skills in real-world situations? Are the assessments fair? Do they accurately measure students' progress? Do they provide useful feedback for both teachers and students? If exercises only involve filling in the blanks or choosing from multiple-choice answers, students won't develop higher-order thinking skills. Challenge them to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information. Don't just make them recall facts. Assessments should also reflect real-world language use. Get students ready for the challenges they'll face outside the classroom. For example, if you want your students to be able to give presentations, give them opportunities to practice giving presentations in class. Our fourth criterion is self-study and learner autonomy support. A good textbook should help students become more independent learners. It should give them the tools to practice on their own and reflect on their learning. Does the textbook have activities students can do to check their own understanding? Does it have prompts to encourage students to think about their strengths and weaknesses? Does it have extra online materials for students to practice outside of class? Some textbooks assume that all learning happens in the classroom. They don't consider students who need more flexibility or who want extra practice. A good textbook has lots of resources for independent study, like self-check activities, reflection prompts, and extra online materials. If a textbook doesn't have good self-study components, it can be a disadvantage for students who need more flexibility in their learning. Not everyone can attend every class. And some students learn better when they have extra opportunities to practice. A comprehensive textbook considers different learning needs and styles. Our fifth criterion is learner engagement. This is super important for keeping students motivated and making sure they have a good learning experience. Ask yourself, do the materials capture students' interest? Do they encourage students to participate actively? Do they keep students motivated throughout the course? Think about whether the topics and themes are relevant to your students' interest, cultural backgrounds, and real-world concerns. When things are relevant, it makes students curious and helps them see the value in what they're learning. It's also important to have a variety of interactive exercises to keep things interesting and prevent boredom. Repetitive and uninspiring exercises can make students lose interest and give up. Try to find a balance between challenge and accessibility. You want your students to feel motivated and challenged, but not overwhelmed. Visuals, graphics, overall design books should be engaging, functional. They should help students understand the material, not just be there to be pretty. That should help students understand the material, not just be there, they're pretty. A visually appealing textbook can make learning more enjoyable, but it shouldn't sacrifice content for style. Textbooks that don't have engaging visuals or that are too difficult or too easy can contribute to student disengagement. Aim for visually stimulating materials that are appropriately challenging and relevant to your students' lives. Our final criterion is teacher and learner compatibility. This is about the practical aspects of using the textbook in the classroom. Ask yourself, are the materials practical and adaptable for teachers? Do they meet the needs of different types of students? It's important to have clear instructions for both teachers and students. This makes it easier to use the textbook and helps lessons run smoothly. Flexibility is also key. You want to be able to adapt the lessons to meet the needs of your students and your teaching context. A rigid textbook can limit your ability to do this. A good textbook should cater to different learning styles, whether students learn best by seeing, hearing, or doing. Provide a variety of activities to suit everyone's preferences. Comprehensive assessment tools and teacher resources can make your life much easier. They can help you plan lessons and provide support throughout the teaching process. A good teacher's book should be your go-to guide for using the textbook effectively. A textbook that doesn't have clear instructions, flexibility, or support for different types of learners can be a challenge for both teachers and students. Choose a user-friendly and adaptable textbook that caters to different learning styles and provides plenty of support for planning and teaching effective lessons. So after looking at all of these external and internal factors, you're finally ready to make a decision. You've thought about how usable the textbook is, how well it would work for different learners, how adaptable it is, and how flexible you can be with it. Now you have three choices. You can adopt it, you can adapt it, or you can reject it. If the textbook checks most of your boxes and it seems like it'll be effective for your students, you might decide to adopt it. That means you think it has a good balance of skills, engaging activities, good teaching methods, and it fits with your teaching style and your students' needs. But maybe the textbook has potential, but needs a little tweaking to fit your classroom. That's when you might choose to adapt it. You can add some extra materials to strengthen the weaker parts or change some of the exercises to better suit your students' learning styles. But if the textbook just doesn't cut it, if it's boring, has problems with its teaching methods, or doesn't cover the skins in a balanced way, it's time to reject it. Keep looking for something better. A textbook that doesn't match your learning goals to curriculum or your students' needs won't help anyone. It'll just make teaching harder and students won't learn as much. And remember, textbook evaluation doesn't stop once you've chosen a book. The real evaluation happens when you're using it in the classroom. Don't be afraid to ask your students for feedback. They can give you valuable insights into what works and what doesn't. Paying attention to how the textbook is working while you're using it and after you've finished a unit or a semester gives you a much better understanding of how effective it really is. It helps you see if it really meets your learner's need, if it works in your classroom, and if it fits with your teaching style. Think of evaluation as a continuous process. It's all about reflecting and improving your teaching. So let's go back to this Lynn. Remember her. She was trying to decide between the new textbook and the government-mandated one. Now she has the tools to evaluate both books and make a good decision. She can figure out if the new book is really what her students need or if she can adapt the current one to make it more engaging and effective. And you can do the same. There's no one-size-fits-all textbook. The key is to think critically, look closely at your options, and choose what works best for your students and your teaching goals. Remember, no textbook is perfect. It's up to you to use your professional judgment and your experience to make the best choice. So I hope this deep dive into textbook evaluation has been helpful. I hope you've learned some useful strategies and that you feel more confident about choosing and using textbooks. Now, I want you to think about your own teaching. What are some of the challenges you face when choosing materials? Think about what we've talked about today and use it to design your own materials. And when you're ready, share your ideas in the forum. Let's learn from each other and build a community of teachers who are passionate about creating great learning experiences for our students. Remember, materials development is a journey. It's all about exploring, experimenting, and constantly refining what we do. By using those principles of textbook evaluation that we talked about today, you're not just picking a textbook. You're creating effective learning experiences for your students. So keep learning, keep sharing, and keep inspiring your students to become confident and successful English speakers. Until next time, happy teaching.